Good morning and welcome to Inquirer Live. I'm Trudy Rubin, Worldview foreign affairs columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I'm delighted to be joined by Admiral James Stavridis and author Elliot Ackerman. We'll be talking about their new book, 2034, a novel of the next world war, in which Chinese nationalism, American hubris, and U.S. misunderstanding of the Chinese government's advances in cyber warfare lead both sides to blunder into an unintended nuclear war. This bestseller is a provocation to make Americans start thinking about how to prevent such a disaster. And we couldn't have two better experts than 2034's authors. Four-star Admiral Stavridis was Supreme Allied Commander at NATO. He commanded a Navy destroyer, a destroyer squadron, and an aircraft battle group in combat. And he also holds a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, where he served 5 years as dean. Elliot Ackerman is the author of 4 novels, one nominated for the National Book Award, along with a memoir, all of which touch on the impact of war. And his insights are drawn from 5 tours of duty as a Marine officer in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he received the Silver Star and the Bronze Star for Valor. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping details so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the discussion, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions for Admiral Stavridis and Elliot Ackerman. To do so, please click on the black bar below that says View Comments and type in your questions. If you're on social media, you can visit us on Inquirer.com/Trudy Live to submit your questions. Please keep them brief. We want to get to as many as we can at the Q&A session at the end of the discussion. Admiral Stavridis has to leave the discussion at 11:45, but luckily Mr. Ackerman will be staying until noon to answer more questions. So I'm delighted to be able to talk to them about a subject that is front and center in the news. Let me start by asking Admiral Stavridis, why did you write this book?
Well, Trudy, first, thank you for having us on. I began to write this book about the future when I looked at the past. And I mean that in the key sense of looking back toward the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And it occurred to me, one of the reasons we never ended up in a hot war with the Soviet Union, which of course would have been catastrophic, was because there exists a rich body of literature about how terrible it would be if the US and the Soviet Union had managed to get into a war. So think of films like Dr. Strangelove, The Bedford Incident, novels like On the Beach by Neville Shute, Red Storm Rising by Tom Clancy. Sir John Hackett wrote a novel called The Third World War. So we imagined how terrible it would be. And with that in mind and looking at the danger of a war with China, I went to my publisher and said, okay, I've written 9 books of nonfiction. I want to try and write a novel. And my publisher said, in a nutshell, Admiral, you're a great writer, but why don't we team you up with someone who has a little more experience writing novels? And that's how Elliot and I came together. And if I could, Trudy, I'd ask Elliot to pick up the story at that point.
That would be great. And I just want to add, Elliot, when we've talked before about why fiction, you talked about the need for imagination. So if you could pick up from there.
Sure. And also thanks for having us today, Trudy. Jim and I have known each other for the better part of a decade. When he was the dean at the Fletcher School, he had invited me to be the writer in residence there for a semester. when he sent me a email with a list of my responsibilities, one of the bullet points was talk with the dean about books when he feels like it. So, we already had kind of a history and knew one another's sensibilities, and coincidentally shared an editor at Penguin Press. So, the Admiral had the idea for this book. Our editor said, well, why don't you work with a novelist? And yes, and aren't you and Elliot friends? So we started talking about this book, and I think the way we were very much aligned early on in the vision, which would be a novel that was really a character-driven story about how two nations, China and the United States, could sleepwalk into war. And so, yes, if you pick up this book, the technology is certainly present, the geopolitics are certainly present, but really the core and the soul of this book are an international cast really of 5 principal characters, and you experience the world of 2034 through their eyes, through their perspective, and really through their politics too. So, when the Chinese character steps onto the page, you view the world according to him. Same with the Iranian character and others. And I think specific to what you mentioned with regards to imagination, Trudy, I think the spirit behind this book is if you look at really the last 100 years, I'd say the great national security catastrophes that the United States has faced have really been, probably Pearl Harbor, the September 11th attacks, and now this pandemic. And I think in all 3 cases, one could say, and it was actually explicitly said in the 9/11 Commission report, that these were failures of imagination. So understanding that, it is just obvious that imagination now is really a national security imperative. And we need to do this type of imaginative work so we can avoid these types of catastrophes. And in this book, again, there is no one nation that is portrayed as being the villain, or no one character who is the villain. The villain in this book is war itself.
Well, you said, Admiral, that your inspiration was books about the Cold War with the Soviet Union on the beach, and movies from books, Dr. Strangelove. Now, these all involved sleepwalking into nuclear war. Is the relationship with China a new Cold War, analogous to the old Cold War, or is it something different?
I think it is something different, but we've seen this movie before. And again, as I said, writing a book about the future, I look to the past, not only Cold War literature, Trudy, but all the way back over 100 years ago to World War I. How did World War I begin? Here are the leading nations of the world at this point. Their economies are very intertwined, much like the economy of the US and China are intertwined today. And indeed, the royal families were related and connected by blood and marriage. The Kaiser was the nephew of Queen Victoria, for example. Yet those nations managed, again, to sleepwalk into a war. How did that happen? There were a number of different reasons for it, but certainly a key one was miscalculation. A sense that the other side would back down, a sense that we can have this over and done with, the troops will be home by Christmas, and miscalculation when an assassination, a single event occurs in the Balkans, in Sarajevo, an assassination of a member of the royal family of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. From that one bullet comes World War I, all that happens in the interwar years, World War II, 80 million die. The catalyst is that assassination. There were certainly plenty of underlying conditions. Read Barbara Tuchman's magisterial book, The Guns of August, about how this all occurred. That's what it feels like to me, that the conditions ought to cause us not to go to war. We're economically intertwined. We have excellent communications. We can work with China on lots of different things. But miscalculation, hubris, arrogance, a spark. In the novel, 2034, it begins in the South China Sea. And I'll close by saying, Elliot, and I know this well, these are by and large very young people who are forward, who are marching on those trails in Afghanistan, who are flying jets over the Taiwan Strait, who are driving destroyers into the Black Sea. They're young in many cases. They're not old and wise. They haven't been through innumerable experiences and wars, and the chance for a miscalculation is not insignificant, unfortunately.
How did we get here? It seemed only recently that engagement was the buzzword with China and the Chinese government, and our intertwined economies was supposed to make war impossible. So how did we get to where we are? And is this Cold War II? I mean, how do you describe the relationship right now?
Well, I've looked to the past twice, and now I'm really going to look to the past. We'll go back 2,500 years ago to Athens and Sparta. And here we see an established power challenged by a rising power. And what results is the Peloponnesian War, a global war for that time. The historian who chronicled it, Thucydides, has now given his name to this as a syndrome in human history. It's been very well analyzed and studied by a friend and mentor of mine, Professor Graham Allison of Harvard University, and this is now called the Thucydides Trap, where an established power is challenged by a rising power and a collision occurs, even though it's not in the interest of either nation. So how did we get here? We got here by repeating history because the established power feels threatened by the rising power. The established power doesn't want to lose primacy in the international order. The established power wants to be able to dictate terms of the international system. The rising power, in this case China, has a very different view, and it creates a friction in the South China Sea, where China claims as territorial waters the South China Sea, over Taiwan, which China sees as a renegade province, over trade and tariff activities, which the United States feels are unfair, about conflict in cyber. So there are many elements of friction and conflict which are occurring to this backdrop, this leitmotif that we've seen played over and over again in human history. It ought to concern us.
As you know, I just want to follow up, Admiral Stavridis. As you know, there's controversy over the concept of the Thucydides trap.
Yeah.
On the one hand, Professor Allison and his students did a study of the past 500 years of history, and they claim that looking at 16 instances where you had rising great powers competing with a declining great power, in only 4 of them was war avoided. One of them being the US and the Soviet Union, where Mr. Gorbachev voluntarily refused to use force in East Germany. So on the one hand, the historical examples look troubling. On the other hand, many people think that this is an exaggeration. There's already a question coming in here that says, why don't we get past the fiction that China is an unstoppable rising power and join with partners, especially Japan, India, Australia, Taiwan, to ensure the security of the Indo-Pacific? So over-exaggeration, or is the Thucydides trap a very necessary caution?
I think it's a very necessary precaution, but nothing is determined. Nothing is written in stone. That's why we set the novel 10 to 15 years in the future. No one knows how the course that these two nations are going to steer will come out. I take the point that China is certainly not 10 feet tall. China, and I say that as someone who's 5 feet 6 inches tall. China is not 10 feet tall. China has many challenges. Their demographics are against them. Their population is aging rapidly. They have a misbalance between men and women in the society, many more men than women, brought about by the one-child policy and the practice of aborting female fetuses. They have immense environmental challenges that are going to have to be remediated at extensive cost. They are not a democracy. And as a result, there's no safety valve as internal tensions build up. And their society is not as cohesive as we tend to portray it in cartoon-like views of China. There's a great deal of dissent in many ways, including from the Uyghur population, the large Muslim population in the Xinjiang province. And then finally, China has almost no allies, partners, and friends. As the question correctly states, we have NATO, 30 nations. We have Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Singapore, on and on and on. Many allies here in this hemisphere to the south, benign neighbors to north and south. So no, China's not 10 feet tall. Having said all of that, China is ambitious, clever. They have a plan, one belt, one road. They have a dynamic leader in President Xi. I think we ought to keep our eye on that looming tower because it would be a mistake to simply say, let's not exaggerate the threat, or our economies are completely intertwined. We'll never go to war with them. Really? Tell that to the Europeans of 1914.
Well, Elliot, you in this book, you both have emphasized the role of new technologies, both for good and for bad. And in the book, America's supposed superiority militarily is overcome by China using asymmetric warfare and somehow surprising us by hacking our command systems so Washington can't communicate with ships in the South China Sea. And in addition, Russia cuts underwater cables in alliance with China, are actually on its own, just making trouble, and puts America into the dark. Now, would it really be so easy to blind us? Have we become too complacent? Is the Pentagon prepared for new kinds of warfare?
I think that a over-reliance upon technology, particularly if it's the wrong technology and one that is vulnerable to disruption, is absolutely an enormous liability in any nation's national security strategy. And it's a theme that we analyze at great length through the story of the book, through the incidents that you mentioned. One of the precipitating events in the book is a massive cyber attack on the United States. And you mentioned, you see, the Russians sort of taking advantage of the chaos that this conflict between the U.S. and China has started on the world stage, snips the underwater cables, sowing even greater chaos that they try to take advantage of. But this is not a news story that one nation goes to war heavily reliant on a technology that is cutting edge and state of the art, but it turns out to be the wrong technology. An example that I love, because I'm a big fan of Shakespeare, is in his play Henry V. That play is all about the Battle of Agincourt, which occurred between the British and the French in 1415. And if you know anything about that battle, a large French army on their home turf was arrayed against a much smaller British force. These French knights were wearing, for 1415 standards, state-of-the-art, high-tech plate armor. There was nothing more cutting edge in 1415. That's what they were wearing. It was very heavy. And they charged across a muddy field, got slowed down in the mud because it rained the night before. And the smaller English force had a different technology, which was not as expensive, but very, very effective, which was the longbow. And they slaughtered these French knights to a man at Agincourt. So, one of the great British victories. So you see this play out time and time again, where if you are overinvested in the wrong technology, it can become a massive liability. And I don't want to give away what happens in the book, but you certainly see that there are specific concepts where America has believed, and we have believed this for decades, that we have total technological dominance in one area. And then it's proved that that technology is the wrong technology. I will only say, specific to the book, that it is not accidental that the first aircraft you see in the book is a state-of-the-art F-35 stealth fighter. And the last aircraft you see the Americans flying in the book is a Generation 1, circa 1990s F-18 Hornet, because that older generation Hornet turns out to be the right technology for the job at the end of the day.
Well, Admiral Stavridis, during the first Cold War, and I leave aside the fact that this is not exactly Cold War II, but during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, there were all kinds of confidence building measures to ensure that mistakes such as happened in the book didn't happen. There were also nuclear arms agreements that established mutually assured destruction. So each side knew where they stood and wouldn't use those weapons because it knew there was a second strike capacity and they would be wiped out. But now there seems to be a critical lack of dialogue between the US military and the Chinese military, the US government and the Chinese government. And so far, Xi Jinping has not been interested in nuclear talks, which have been proposed by the US government. So how do we move forward with setting some rules of the road so that you won't have between US and China misunderstandings that lead to a war neither wants?
Indeed, Trudy, this is one of the messages of the book, is that if we don't start creating those kind of norms of deterrence and norms of behavior by 10 to 15 years from now, it is conceivable that one or both nations would say, well, we got off to a conventional arms skirmish here, but that skirmish led to a big conventional battle, and maybe one of the nations doesn't do so well in that battle and then becomes tempted to pull out of the arsenal a tactical nuclear weapon, perhaps saying, hey, we can control this. We'll control the ladder of escalation. We'll only use it out at sea, for example. And that'll convince our opponent that we're not moving toward a strategic nuclear arms exchange. I think that's very faulty thinking. And we try to illuminate how difficult it is to control that ladder of escalation, particularly as you are on the fine edge between massive conventional attack and tactical nuclear weapons. So you're absolutely correct to point that one of the salutary things that occurred in the Cold War were a series of measures. They included direct hotlines between military commanders. They included something called the Incidents at Sea Protocol, which was agreed to by the US Navy and the Soviet Navy, and it delineated how close or how far apart ships would operate, warships, how close military aircraft could fly to each other, how close a military aircraft could fly to a warship, when you could turn on and when you could not turn on your fire control radar, when you could open the doors to the torpedo launch in your submarine. All of these were delineated in these incident at sea protocols. We don't have those. And finally, we also do not have not only nuclear arms control talks and protocols, but cyber and cyber security discussions, because I assure you, these offensive cyber weapons are already approaching the level of damage that can be inflicted on a society to make them comparable to nuclear weapons. By 10 to 15 years from now, as quantum computing comes online, they will be only more lethal. So we have work to do. And one of the messages here in the real world of today that I am carrying as I have all of these conversations around the country about 2034 is the need for precisely the kind of conversations that you have talked about.
Do you have any specific suggestions, Admiral, about other measures that can be taken to prevent the Thucydides Trap thesis that a rising power is probably destined to go to war with one that is perceived to be in decline?
I will give you a very quick sketch map of what I think we ought to be doing. And from what I can see, this is roughly what the Biden administration is working to do. Number one is quite simple. It's have a plan. I think the Trump administration correctly saw the threat, saw this looming tower, but they never quite got a plan that integrated military activity, diplomatic activity, economic activity, cultural exchanges, technology applications, no coherency of plans. So number one is have a plan, put a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year markers out there for what you want to do in terms of shifting the military from being French knights in armor. Where are those long bows of the 21st century? They're in cyber, in space, in unmanned vehicles, in special forces. So have a plan that looks at the military, diplomatically have a plan that tends the garden of our allies, partners, and friends. And that was something I fault the Trump administration for not working more closely with NATO, Australia, Japan, all of our allies, partners, and friends. That's a garden that needs to be tended. And then thirdly, and I could go on at considerable length, I won't, you get the idea. Thirdly, economically, we need to link together the other aspects of the plan. And in that economic basket, I would put support to technology that ensures we do not fall irreparably behind. The private sector can't do it all. It's going to need research and development from the federal government, STEM education at every level in our society, identifying the best and brightest, both people and ideas, and advancing them. We have a lot of work to do here, and what we need is a coherent plan. And I'll close with this. We ought to confront China where we must on their claims of ownership of the South China Sea, on genocidal-like activity in the Xinjiang province against Uyghurs. Confront where we must, but cooperate wherever we can. Find zones of cooperation, climate, potentially arms controls we just discussed, humanitarian operations, preparation for the next pandemic. I can think of many areas where we could cooperate with China, build some confidence. This is complicated, it's hard, but it is the most important issue in international relations, I think, for the next 30 years.
Elliot, in the book, you talk about red lines, and it seems that Taiwan and South China Sea are the most explosive potential red lines in a way for both sides. And both of them come into conflict in the book. Do you think that the United States should have strategic clarity, as the phrase goes, about defending Taiwan? Or is that too dangerous? Should we keep a certain ambiguity? You have spent a good chunk of your life fighting wars, and you know in your gut what the consequence of a mistaken assumption can be. Is it too risky to talk about defending Taiwan?
Well, I think obviously red lines are very much linked to the collective will of the American people and whichever administration is in power. And I think our sort of most notorious red line of recent memory is the one with regards to the use of chemical weapons in Syria. So I think now red lines is sort of a term that has lost some of its recent luster. But I think, specific with regards to the South China Sea or with regards to Taiwan, it's very difficult to imagine living in a world in which China exercises its claim on the South China Sea, or in which China unilaterally invades and retakes Taiwan, and we as the United States, along with our allies, allow that to happen and live in the aftermath geopolitically of those events. I mean, it would be such an enormous blow to credibility of the U.S. and the credibility of our allies, that would be difficult to, I think, imagine how that would reorder the world. All that being said, I think about 3 weeks ago there was a poll that showed 75% of Americans believe that if the Chinese went into Taiwan unilaterally, the United States shouldn't intervene. So obviously that's absent of an American president making the case to the electorate. It's absent of the news stories coming out as to what that would actually mean. But I do think there's a real question, and as to whether or not we can enforce these red lines. And in so much as our adversaries, whether it be the Chinese or even the Russians, and what we've seen happen on the border with Ukraine recently, believe that these red lines are in fact porous or fungible, I think that's when we get into very dangerous territory. So I personally believe with issues like Taiwan and the South China Sea, those red lines are important, but it's also important that there is a real muscle behind those red lines. And I think right now the posture of the United States will lead our adversaries to question whether or not we really mean it.
We have a question here wanting to know how much of the book is based on potentially realistic war games and planning. Admiral?
It is based very much on realistic thinking about what a war with China would look like. Famously, I'm the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and I spent the latter part of my career focused on Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the Balkans, piracy off the coast of Africa. But the first really half of my career has been spent in the Pacific. I have driven destroyers through the South China Sea. I've been a Commodore in command of a group of destroyers. I've commanded a carrier strike group. I will simply stipulate that there is a fair amount of realism in here. There's no classified information that's revealed. We keep the book at a level of speculation. It's set 10 to 15 years in the future, but certainly it is informed by my life and experiences.
A questioner asks, I think the layperson in the U.S. doesn't understand this conflict or the potential for disaster. Was this novel an effort to provide better understanding of these issues in order to help us avoid this possible war? In other words, what is the conversation you hope to provoke? Let me start with Elliot, and I'll then turn to the Admiral.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is certainly one of the objectives of the book, is to get people imagining what these events would look like, and frankly, to begin recognizing the patterns. We were talking before about the First World War. I think if you look at that history, you can see that the participants were engaging in behaviors where they were not self-aware of the outcomes those behaviors would lead to. And so through telling stories, we can all collectively start to recognize the patterns of our behaviors. And this is something that we very much saw with the Cold War literature, was despite how far apart the United States and the Soviet Union were in terms of lifestyle and worldviews, there was a consensus between our two nations that a third world war would be absolutely cataclysmic for the human race. Right now, there are very few stories that exist in this space, even as both the United States and China continue to embark upon a political discussion that seems like a collision course. So it is a contribution to telling that type of a story, so we can start doing the imaginative work and avoid this type of conflict.
Yeah, I would add one thing we wanted to help illustrate was how quickly these events could spiral out of control, how a seemingly small incident in the South China Sea could escalate, and that despite the best efforts, perhaps, on both sides to avoid an exchange of tactical nuclear weapons, it could happen. And here, I often say, big doors swing on small hinges. And a couple times in the novel, you see moments where, as a reader, you're just screaming to, pull the keys out of the car, stop what you're doing. And a couple of the characters are desperately trying to do so. They're blocked by another character. That's all real. I had 6 tours in the Pentagon, 1 at State Department, 1 at the National Security Council staff. I know this terrain as well as I do the mountains of Afghanistan or the seas of the South China Sea. And big doors swing on these small hinges, and it is very easy to lose sight of the big picture. And suddenly that internal rivalry, that anger, it collides on a staff between a principal and a staff member, and you are off to the races. That's what we want to avoid, and that's part, yes, of why the novel is couched in the way it is.
One other danger, Admiral, that gets touched on in the book is the danger of hypernationalism on both sides. And I want to ask about both sides. In your book, the Chinese officials repeatedly give their opinions that America is in serious decline. And recently, those kinds of remarks are made frequently in public, especially after the early phases of the pandemic and the October 6th insurrection. How do we reverse this perception? And I will get to hypernationalism on the US side, but on the Chinese side, how do we convey a more realistic picture of where the United States is?
There's no silver bullet. We can't just put out a couple of tweets and snap our hands and say, hey, we're kind of back, as the Biden administration talks about, America is back. And I applaud that. But there's a big difference through the eyes of our allies, our partners, our friends, and our opponents who may be skeptical about that, and justifiably so. And in particular, they may be skeptical about what's going to happen in the midterm election, what's going to happen in 2024. And this whipsaw back and forth undermines our credibility in that regard. What we can do about it is to take the fact that China is a fairly bipartisan issue. There's a reasonable sense of collegiality in the idea that we have to confront China. We should confront them where we must. We want to avoid breaking the relationship and ending up in a war. I think that's pretty well received wisdom on both sides of the aisle. So I think the China situation is something that the United States can use in speaking to our allies, partners, and friends in order to convince them that we are not going to change and change back again, but we have to work to do that. Churchill said democracy, the worst form of government, except for all the others. And this, frankly, is one of the areas in which democracy can be frustrating, both internally and externally. Let me close with another thought, because in the book, we see a United States that has lost many of its allies. It's lost military credibility and real advantage, and it ends up in this very destructive combat with China. I don't think that's the future for our nation, but I would make that caution that if we don't pay attention to these issues here domestically in the United States, we will run the risk of heading toward the events of 2034. I'll finish with this. The president in this book is a woman. That should surprise no one. In fact, I'd only be surprised if we have not had a woman president by 2034. But in the novel, she is neither a Republican nor a Democrat. I think that's part of our way out of this, not blowing up those political parties, but finding people, presumably like this president, who can gather support on both sides. I think by the 10 to 15 year future, it's very possible we may see that syndrome. Trudy, I'm going to have to leave it there, and I'll leave you in the capable hands of my co-author. Thank you very much for having me on. It was a real pleasure. As always, such perceptive thoughts and questions, not only from you, but from this Inquirer audience. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for being here. So, Elliot, let me follow up on the issue we were just describing about hypernationalism on both sides. Uh, it in the past administration, less so now, of course, but there was a whipping up of feeling that didn't distinguish between Chinese government, Chinese people, a sort of hysteria. And that has not gone away in some corners of American politics. How risky is it to stir up these kinds of feelings, which not only lead to anti Asian prejudice in our country, but can lead potentially under a different administration than the current one to misjudgments on entering a conflict?
I think we're certainly in a position where, I think cooler voices need to prevail. But I think we're at a moment where our leaders need to handle the current relationship between the United States and China, particularly coming out of the pandemic, with frankly, a degree of sophistication that does not exist right now in our political discourse. I mean, on the one hand, ginning up anti-Chinese, uber-American nationalist sentiment is not going to bode well for policymakers as we try to avoid future conflicts with China. At the same time, sort of accepting hook, line, and sinker a Chinese narrative as to what has happened in this pandemic, is preposterous, and frankly, the American people shouldn't have to swallow that. They shouldn't have to swallow these sort of specious claims that the pandemic started with a frozen pangolin in the wet market in Wuhan that just seemed completely incredulous, based off of all of the other reporting that we've seen. Much of it very credible reporting coming out of the United States by very esteemed journalists like Lawrence Wright at the New Yorker, who's written amazing pieces about this. So I think that our leaders need to, when speaking to an American audience, thread that needle, and it takes, I think, precision and nuance to do so, and frankly, to combat some of these narratives. I think as you know, Trudy, there's a very strong narrative thread that's come out of this pandemic, which has been, the pandemic has really shown some of the faults of the American system, and has really shown some of the superior traits of a highly centralized Chinese system. And we've seen that narrative in media and other places that, maybe this really augurs in the end of the American decentralized system. And I think any person logically sees that, the logic just completely doesn't hold up. It's an authoritarian, overly centralized Chinese system that delivered this pandemic, because when there were early warning signs, all of those voices were quashed, and it allowed the pandemic to spread in a way that a government that operated more transparently, or a nation that had an open and free media, it would never have been allowed to spread, because people would have been saying, we have a problem in Wuhan and we need to deal with it right away. So I think on the American side, it requires our leaders to both figure out how to say, on the one hand, the pandemic evidences many of the challenges that exist with a very strong and rising China being a authoritarian state, but on the other hand, doesn't gin up anti-Chinese sentiment in a way that has the American people sort of, clamoring for war or some type of punitive measures that will obviously have negative outcomes for all parties involved, which ultimately, war does. I mean, like Trudy, we were talking about the Thucydides Trap, and this idea that, you have a rising power, and the rising power challenges the established power. And there's always sort of the assumption, it was one of the things that was fun about writing this novel, that who's going to win, the rising power or the established power, right? Somebody's going to win. Well, newsflash, we talk about Germany and Britain being an example of Thucydides Trap in the 20th century. Neither Germany nor Britain won those wars, meaning they did not come out of the First or Second World War particularly stronger. They both came out in nations in decline. And it was us, the United States, who were actually the true beneficiaries of that war. And so, 2034, we set it up. I mean, it's a contest between the United States and China. But without spoiling the plot, I will tell you, by the time you get to the end of the book, you realize neither the United States nor China has come out looking very well at the end of this war.
Right. And I won't spoil it by saying who turns out to be the mediator, unless you want to mention it.
I don't, but I would say oftentimes the nation that is the most wise is not the nation who starts wars. The nation that is the most wise is the nation that figures out how to end wars. And in the 20th century, something the United States did very well in the First and Second World War, those were two wars that we did not start. We certainly ended them, and we were the beneficiaries of the world order that was established after those wars.
You mentioned wars that we started and didn't finish. And you are a veteran of forever wars, both of the longest running ones. How did that inform the way that you look at the potential for US-China conflict, your experience in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Well, I think it's important to know, the conflict that we are imagining in 2034 is one that's very different than the wars that I fought in, and that it's focused on conventional operations. It's highly kinetic. It's very, very lethal. I think when we look back at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we kind of tally up the costs, both the costs in terms of blood and treasure. There's also a hidden cost that's not being talked about as much, which is the opportunity cost within the U.S. military of being singularly focused on these insurgencies in the Middle East for 20 years, and sort of the brain drain that has caused. In so much as right now, we're seeing the U.S. military is trying to conduct a very quick pivot. The idea of actually our next greatest challenge is not going to be the perpetuation of these forever wars. It's going to be, how do we fight against a peer level or near peer level adversary? And that's something that has not been the thrust of intellectual thought in the military for going on 2 decades, and we're playing catch up. The real opportunity cost of the forever wars is that we have sort of been caught sleeping with regards to how we might fight against a peer level adversary. And I think that we have those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have left a very long tail that we are still trying to clean up.
I want to revert back to something we were discussing before about misunderstandings on both the Chinese and US side about what is going on in each other's countries. This, it seems, holds real potential for creating public opinion pressures that can push governments towards doing things that are unwise, even in China, where it's an authoritarian system and top down. So is there enough information for the American public about Chinese life, Chinese people, especially when journalists have been kicked out? I remember writing about the hero Chinese doctor in Wuhan who tried to, Dr. Li, who tried to alert his own government to what was going on, but was silenced because of an authoritarian system and later died. So, without journalistic coverage, there's too much coverage of potential conflict, perhaps. So firstly, do you think that's a problem? And secondly, do you think that exchanges with students or with cultural exchanges, do they make any difference? Are there ways that each side's people can be humanized to each other, which might soften public pressures for conflict?
I'll answer the second part of the question first. Yes, I mean, sort of, second tier diplomacy, I think is important and continues to be important, and I believe is worthwhile. even as much has been written about, for instance, the Chinese government's role in things like the Confucius organizations on university campuses. I think even that withstanding, it's important to have that type of cultural exchange between the United States and China, so that we can, as you said, Trudy, humanize one another and not, erect ever higher walls between our two cultures. That being said, I think the lack of journalistic freedom that exists inside China, and I think the fact that most Americans know far less about China than Chinese people do about America is a real issue of concern. I think that the United States, and this is something, a criticism one could level against the United States throughout our history, is we are frequently a very inward-looking nation until we are forced through some catastrophe to be outward-looking. And I think that I would be flabbergasted if the authorities that be in China were not very carefully watching U.S. sentiment with regards to issues like Taiwan and the South China Sea, and noting how our internal polarization makes us unable to focus on those issues, and sees that as a liability that the U.S. holds, and that if China ever wanted to act against Taiwan or wanted to act decisively in the South China Sea, that if divisions of the United States were high enough, they might be able to act with impunity in those areas. I'll just add, Trudy, I don't know about you, but sort of in the last 6 or 7 years before the pandemic, I'd often be, having a drink with a friend or having dinner, and as the partisanship and kind of the dysfunction in American political life was just getting ever and ever higher, sort of wonder wistfully, I wonder if something really horrible were to happen, like a 9/11 were to happen again, if this country would be able to come together again, as we did sort of after 9/11, to form some type of coherent response. And then the pandemic happened. And I think if the pandemic we've seen was the most divisive year in American history, probably at least since 1968, if not before then. So I think our adversaries clearly see that, and I can't imagine that's not informing their strategic calculus.
That leads to a question from the viewers. Short of a direct attack like Pearl Harbor, would the U.S. be prepared to act in a major conflict?
And I don't know. I think we mentioned before there was a recent poll that showed 75% of Americans would be against acting if the Chinese went into Taiwan unilaterally. Again, that being said, conditions change when there is an invasion of that sort. The president is going to go make his or her case to the American people as to why this is in our interest. But I myself do not know, and I imagine the most senior levels of leadership in nations that are adversarial to the United States are asking themselves that very same question as they try to figure out how they are going to behave in their own backyards.
There's another similar question. Do you think that other hotspots such as North Korea or the Eastern Mediterranean with Syria and an ever more unstable Turkey could lead to an inadvertent superpower face-off?
I think potentially anything can happen. I think the most clear connections I can see, and that Jim and I kind of saw, and why we wrote this book, was between the United States and China, because that is an area where you really have peer level competition. I think with regards to Syria, we could see about 5 years ago when the Russians intervened in Syria and the Turks were intervening in Syria and the Americans were intervening in Syria, it was very easy to, again, imagine one of these situations where there's some type of precipitating incident, an American jet is shot down by a Russian jet, that incident causes events to escalate out of control. And I think in a place like Syria, there was certainly real concern there. And there's also always been that concern vis-a-vis North Korea, that there could be one miscalculation that leads to a broader war. So we imagine that happening in the South China Sea, but I think that's always a risk anywhere you look around the world.
Well, before we sign off, I would like to ask you to say a bit more about what is the conversation that you hope this book will provoke, and among whom?
I hope that someone who reads this book will enjoy it, because I like to say, for a book that's about a very grim subject, Jim and I, we had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun writing it, and I think it is a fun book. But I think you'll take a journey in this book. You'll go into this sort of alternate 34 we've created. You'll finish the book and you'll say, you know what, like, life is pretty good right now, actually. Whether you're American, Chinese, Iranian, like, this is not a path we ever want to walk down. And we should be aware of the pitfalls that exist in the relationships between our countries, so that we will never, ever walk down this path. And so we've done the imaginative work to try to show the reader what it would look like, so that it never occurs. And I hope Americans, people from China, I hope anyone would read this book, so that we'll never come close to engaging in these events. And that's very much the spirit of the book.
Have you sent Xi Jinping a copy?
No, but I'm really hoping he'll read it.
Well, there's one other point that you inserted into this book, and you mentioned it, but I just want to mention it again in terms of, was this part of your message? And we have a couple of minutes left, but maybe you can comment. You mentioned that the female president belonged to neither party. Now, I didn't tell our viewers that you worked on a serious effort to try to encourage an independent candidate for president in a past election. And so what was the message of having an independent candidate? And what are you trying to hint to readers about what might be necessary for America to present a stronger picture of a country that is capable of handling its business at home and abroad?
Well, I think it's the idea of sort of knocking ourselves out of this reality where frequently we identify more closely with, we're either Republicans or we're Democrats, and we're not necessarily Americans. Nowhere in our founding documents does it say that there has to be a Republican or a Democratic Party. Our first president was a political independent, George Washington, and in his farewell address, he warned explicitly about what he called factions and what we call political parties today, and could see how deleterious they could be to the effective functioning of a republic. And so I think we need to, as our politics gets ever more dysfunctional, it's worth us kind of returning to basic principles, which is that we're Americans. Like, this is all of our home, and we don't necessarily need our political parties to act as intermediaries between us and our elected officials. And so we wanted to, put that character in there just to mark that, yes, there could be an independent president, and imagine what that would be like.
All right. Well, I thank you very much, Elliot Ackerman. And I hope that the conversation this book will stimulate will make all of us think about how to avoid unnecessary war and communicate our feelings about that to our elected officials. Thanks so much, and bye for now.
Thank you for having me, Trudy.